Hi, I'm Tom Eschen, and welcome to the award-winning Power and Politics podcast. It's the conversation about the issues that are impacting you the most with the people that are making the decisions, the advocates calling for change, and everyone in between, and holding them accountable along the way, too. As the state budget remains in limbo, it's late, it is not done yet here in New York, we speak with the NYCLU Executive Director, Donna Lieberman. She talks about some of the issues that are on the table for them when it comes to advocating for and against, and that includes barrier zones when it comes to churches and places of worship, along with reproductive sites as well. We also speak about the CLCPA, the climate law, why they're putting their finger on the pulse of that, immigration and how that's being enforced. So we go through some of the issues that really matter to them and what they would say to the lawmakers that are in the room right now. You can always listen wherever you get your podcasts, on our Power and Politics podcast page, or watch on YouTube at CBS 6 Albany. We're joined today by Donna Lieberman, the Executive Director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. Donna, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for speaking with us today.
I'm happy to be with you. Thanks.
So here we are in a budget limbo, I guess you could say. We're in the time between the deadline and when it's actually going to get done. From your standpoint, and I know there's some different issues that have been on the table that you're advocating for and against, and making sure you're having a voice there. What's top line for you right now?
Well, I gotta say, budget limbo is par for our course, isn't it?
Yeah.
For April. We ought to codify that. But the NYCLU is deeply concerned about the whole approach of governors, this governor, our past governor, our last governor, of turning the budget into the big, ugly, one big, beautiful bill, whatever you want to call it, big and way too big. The budget is supposed to be about the finances of the state. Yes, it talks about priorities, of course, but it's not supposed to be about legislating policy. And find me a budget that hasn't been about legislating policy. And, that approach to budgeting, that approach to policy making is a real cop-out and a violation of the norms, of our constitutional norms, because, and it's bad for democracy, because when you throw everything into one big pot, and horse trade away, then the people really don't get to have their voice heard about the specifics of policies that may be important, challenging, easy, whatever. So we oppose this style of governing. That said,
I just want to ask quickly. Does the timeline need to change? Like you said, there's something in the law, or do just the people have to change the way they go about it?
If every governor didn't put such a premium on getting every important policy decision made in the budget, you could get an on-time budget easily. Well, maybe not easily, but with a little bit of hard work. And it's been done. But I think the practice of throwing everything into the budget is not good for New Yorkers. It may be politically expedient, but it's not good for us.
Yeah, I think that there's also the time, right? And that of, like you said, to be able to go and debate specific issues, which you don't really get. And I mean, there is some of that at the end of session as well. You see them go until 4 or 5 in the morning, but that is outside of the budget process, right? I think that's one of the main concerns.
Yeah, it further consolidates power in the hands of a few leaders, and the members kind of get cut out. So, yeah.
So that's okay. Then let's pretend we're in the room right now. With the 3 people in the room, we can add 2 more. And I know that one of the big issues for you when it comes is the proposal around buffer zones. And I know right now involved in some litigation in Nassau County. We've seen also New York City also get involved in something like this, that pending Zohran Mamdani as well here. If you were in the room right now and this conversation would come up, what would be the point that you would want to make to these leaders about this?
Yeah, after pointing out how ludicrous it is to include protest restrictions in a budget bill, I would point out that The courts have been pretty clear that when you impose a buffer zone that creates no speech zones around religious institutions, it's unconstitutional. And there's a really good reason for that. Protest is fundamental and it's also fragile. And when it comes to restrictions on our First Amendment rights, legislatures have to be very careful not to overstep, because when they do, it chills people, it intimidates them from exercising their rights. There is no basis for imposing a 25-foot buffer zone around houses of worship in New York. We're talking 17,000 or more houses of worship in New York, around which, whether it's 25 feet, 30 feet, it may be negotiated, right? You can't engage in protest activity. That's sending a message to New Yorkers at exactly the wrong time in history, I might add, that we do not value the right to political protest. And there has never been a time in my life when protecting protest rights has felt more critical to our democracy.
And it's the New York City Council doing this, I think, is interesting. And I know obviously we have a whole state to consider here, right? And I think that looks different, the protests along with this proposal, if depending on if you're in Manhattan compared to if you're even in Buffalo, which is a city but a whole different dynamic, right? I'd imagine, right? The way you look at it.
Yeah, one of the, if we have laws that protect protest while they protect the right of religious freedom, and all they have to do is enforce those laws. Those laws allow police to balance the needs of our Constitution based on the circumstances at hand. Sweeping with a broad brush to ban protest around houses of worship across the state, there's not been a problem. People going to church, people are going to the mosque, people are going to the synagogue. There is no documented problem, and there's statewide. And in New York, where there have been a couple of incidents that people have pointed to, people actually have been able to go and worship, and the police have every power that they need to improve their tactics moving forward. So this is like legislation that, feels so politically motivated and so wrong. When the President of the United States is doing everything he can to intimidate and demonize his opponents, the protesters, right? This is no time for New York to be jumping on that bandwagon.
I did want to ask, you sort of alluded to it there about, the proponents of this would then say, well, there are the constitutional rights of those that are going to worship, that they have rights to not be harassed, and then they have a right to worship within the confines of their house of worship without being distracted or anything. Then they have that guarantee, a right to practice their religion. Where does that fall for you when it comes to this conversation?
It's fundamental. The right to worship is fundamental. The First
And what if
Amendment
that's being
protects free
impeded upon?
speech. I'm sorry?
What if that's being impeded upon by protesters in this way?
Well, when we have laws, the access to clinic entrances law that protects access to houses of worship. Okay, if you get in the way, if you threaten somebody, if you're intimidating somebody, then there is a law that makes that illegal, and there's no need for new laws. The NYCLU protects the right of religious freedom. It protects the right to worship. We have gone to bat for people's right to worship. What you don't have the right to is to push any protest so far off to the side that you can't see it, out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's what the proponents of this legislation would like to do. But the First Amendment doesn't allow it. The Supreme Court has not upheld buffer zones.
And so this really should be more in terms of law enforcement doing more about what's already there.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
there's experience with this. It's the same law that protects access to abortion clinics. It works fine.
Right. Yeah.
And it hasn't been without its problems, but it works fine. It's when legislators seize upon a moment where seize upon a problem that can be resolved by better enforcement, by changing the law, adding to the law, layering on new stuff. It's such a recipe for failure. Let's look at where the problem is and improve enforcement. You don't need a new law here.
Let's move on in terms of, I know that you're also part of this lawsuit against DHS about some of the immigration enforcement and the alleged profiling of New Yorkers. There was a report, I believe, in December that the New York Immigration Coalition partnered out in Colorado to look at the data. Was that part of looking in for you of advocate? I know this is but this is also part of the New York Civil Rights Act is also something that you've been a proponent for. This, in the terms of this budget conversation, why a priority and why something that you think needs to be addressed?
So, yeah, we think that New York for All and protecting the rights of immigrants is a critical need for New York. And we were hoping, I guess we were hoping against hope, that it would be passed before the budget. We don't think it should be passed as part of the budget. It's not a budget issue. There's pieces of immigration protection that are, I'll get to that in a second. But New York for All, which would prohibit collusion between the state and the Department of Homeland Security, is long overdue in New York. And Governor Hochul has a proposal out there that falls short of what New York needs in order to provide the best protection for New York immigrants and New York values. This is no time for us to cut corners and compromise, because we have a federal government that is driving a Mack truck through every opportunity, every loophole they find, and causing incredible pain and harm. So New York for All, no 287G agreements, which are formal agreements between law enforcement and ICE, but also no informal collaboration. They get a warrant, that's one thing. But without
warrant, right? Yeah,
you get a judicial warrant, and a judicial order to do something, that's one thing. But hey, Joe, you got any immigrants today coming out of your prison? No, heads up. And what happened in Buffalo with Nurul Alam, is exhibit A, perhaps, for why we need this. This is a man who was blind, who was held in custody for a year, who was released by local law enforcement to ICE, who left him out in the coldest weather imaginable, and he froze to death. And it was termed a homicide.
Yep.
New York is better than that. We don't do that kind of stuff, and we can't be accessories to that kind of a crime.
But the governor's proposal too specific? Is that why it doesn't go far enough in terms of the 287, the formal 287G agreement itself? Is that what you're saying?
It's too limited. It's only limited to the formal agreements. But in Buffalo, her proposal would not have helped.
Right.
Because there was no formal agreement to collude with ICE. And there was an informal arrangement, that happened however it happened, and a man lost his life. So, but there is a budget piece for immigrants in the budget that needs to be dealt with, which is full funding for legal services for people who are facing deportation. We know that when somebody is facing deportation, if they are on their own, they face a much greater likelihood of losing their case than if they are appearing with a lawyer by their side. It's common sense, and it's documented that you got a lawyer, you're likely to do so much better because lawyers know how to fight for your rights. And shocking, a 5-year-old may not know how to assert their legal rights. A 2-month-old may not know how to assert their legal rights. A 25-year-old or a 50-year-old as well. You need a lawyer, and New York has the obligation, should have the obligation to fund it.
It's a really interesting concept because, as we know, in criminal court, an individual gets a public defender by law, and that's a part of the process. The immigration doesn't fall under that umbrella. And I've spoken with some immigration lawyers about this. That basically someone might just get put in a room with some books, and it's up to them whether or not they want to, read about habeas corpus or think. It's a very it's a difficult process when it comes to that. And this is 175 million. Generally, there's about 100 million less in the budget. This was from at least the One House side of things this year. This proposal that's that's a response, I'd imagine, to what's going on now.
Yeah.
Sure.
Absolutely. And it's so important, it's not just like your example of somebody thrown in a room with books. Remember, we're talking about infants, we're talking about children, we're talking about adults who speak English, who don't speak English, and if our laws are to mean anything, well, then you have to have a lawyer to help you assert your rights. And New York should be funding that so that nobody is facing deportation with the deck so stacked against them.
I know we're talking a lot of policy here, but that unfortunately is what's holding it up from at least this time.
But this one's numbers. This is a budget piece.
Right. In terms of that, yes. The CLCPA, the 2019 climate law, is another one that you put your finger on the pulse of. Why?
Well, the climate law passed, I think, almost unanimously. And when things happen like that, you gotta say, oh, do they really believe in this? Do they know what they're doing? And the fact that the governor is seizing on this in the budget is really it's unfortunate to say the least. Regulating greenhouse gases, limiting emissions, having goals to have particular levels of reduced emissions is so important for our environment. And at a time when our federal government is doing everything to turn us into, one big greenhouse, and roll back all of the progress of decades of science and common sense, why on earth is the governor capitulating to lobbying interests to roll back our hard-fought protections? And who is it that bears the brunt of increased or failing to roll back carbon emissions? Who is it? Well, we know, of course, the whole planet suffers, but the burden falls mostly on Black and brown communities, because that's where the majority of environmental pollution occurs. So, Mayor Hochul, you got to find other ways to balance the budget, or I mean, it's baloney. This notion that this dichotomy between fiscal responsibility and saving the planet and protecting, communities of color from the disparate impacts of environmental racism. We cannot balance the budget off the backs of our children's future and or off the backs of Black and brown New Yorkers. So, there are other ways to raise revenue or to save money than promoting injustice. And once again, in a climate, did I just say climate? In a climate where the federal government is doing everything to destroy the progress that we had made towards addressing climate change.
Yeah, a lot of the wind, solar, those kind of rollbacks and those projects the governor, in her explanation of this, it seems like she's looking potentially at another. She has a different perspective, as you might imagine, of and she didn't say now, the future of utility costs, which could also impact these populations. What do you make of that argument of, instead of trying to implement this and these future utility costs potentially could go up by her projection or someone that might be saying that, and she's trying to avoid those costs going on to maybe even specifically populations like that?
The governor has to be a little bit more creative than that, and, ensure that we as a state are developing renewable energy sources. And if there are increases in energy costs, that the state is prepared to mitigate those for those in need.
Finally, I wanted to get to funding. Obviously, this is a federal government sort of a backfill conversation when it comes to Planned Parenthood. And that there's a lot of questioning about a specific gender affirming care access fund. Is that, how much of it is that on your radar right now when it comes to this conversation?
Yeah, it's another area where, New York and other states that believe in, equal rights, that believe that people have the right to live their lives as who they are, have to pick up the slack. I mean, I'm not saying it's nothing. It's not nothing, but New York has to pick up the slack so that people who need gender affirming care can get it here in New York without breaking the bank. So yeah, that's that's on our radar screen, and it's very important. And it is a budget item.
It is a funding thing. Donna, we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Good talking to you.
Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button right now so you can stay up to date on these news-making conversations about the issues impacting New Yorkers the most: power and politics.